This video will delve into the unprecedented controversy surrounding farming, especially livestock agriculture. In a first for human history, farming is under systemic attack from multiple fronts. The situation is too important to ignore and generally not well understood by most people. We'll reveal in much detail who's driving this dangerous dynamic and why. Today's anti-livestock groups, despite representing a small portion of the population, wield a disproportionate amount of influence. Their radical stance calls for a drastic reduction or complete elimination of global livestock herds. This development caught many by surprise, and only very few people saw this coming. Consider Professor Kenneth Blackstone's warning from 1991. In the years to come, I am of the opinion that policies will be adumbrated by various pressure groups on the basis of little evidence, pursued assiduously by them and eventually accepted on the basis that, although not scientifically defensible, they have become politically expedient. The professor's words proved prophetic indeed. More than 3 decades later, the situation has become so concerning that a group of experts issued the so-called Dublin Declaration of Scientists on the Societal Role of Livestock. Endorsed by over 1,000 scientists globally, the declaration warns that livestock has become the victim of simplification, reductionism, and zealotry. Activists soon attacked the declaration, claiming it was an overreaction to a well-intentioned call for change. The key question we must address is whether the warnings from Professor Blackstone and the Dublin Declaration were too strong. Are we indeed dealing with a hostile environment for livestock farming, or is this an exaggeration? As this video will explain, the environment is hostile indeed. The current anti-livestock movement is based on a convergence of ideology, profitability, and technocracy, forming a symbiotic relationship that explains its massive influence. But be careful, this should not be viewed simplistically as a monolithic conspiracy, but rather as an alignment of self-interests. Power networks are complex and messy by nature, with some agendas being divergent or contradictory, though think tanks help streamline strategies. In the first part of this exposé, we will look into the role of activist NGOs, driven by animal rights ideology and anti-livestock environmentalism. NGOs are driven by a diverse range of goals and motivations. While many have commendable goals, such as a focus on enhancing animal welfare standards, others are driven by strong ideological biases. They frequently resort to bullying tactics to promote their animal rights agendas. Most NGOs fall somewhere between these poles, often, however, presenting a facade of moderation that may conceal more radical elements. 50 by 40, for instance, stands out as a prominent umbrella group, aiming to reduce the production and consumption of global meat and other animal-sourced foods by 50% by 2040. Whether or not this goal is radical is open to interpretation. Most people may think it is, but what is very clear is that some of its members hold extreme views. Take, for instance, PCRM, or the Physicians' Committee for Responsible Medicine. PCRM is an NGO advocating for vegan diets. Despite its name, the organisation has been criticised for only having a small percentage of actual physicians among its members, functioning more as an animal rights group than a medical organisation. Its president, Neil Barnard, has made various controversial statements, including the comparison of cheese to addictive drugs. Barnard also claimed that feeding animal-sourced foods to children is a form of child abuse, which reflects PCRM's strong animal rights activism rather than a focus on health advocacy. This stance is further supported by PCRM's close ties to PETA, a prominent animal rights organisation that also funds PCRM, and substantially so. From a credibility standpoint, PETA is not exactly the partner one wants to be associated with. As just 2 examples, out of a long list of fanatical assertions, PETA has equated milk consumption with white supremacy and has suggested that the phrase "say cheese" when taking photos is no longer acceptable. Greenpeace, another 50 by 40 associate, is generally seen as a mainstream NGO, acting out of environmental concern. However, its activities can often be highly problematic too. In 2020, Greenpeace published a very dark video with the obvious purpose to terrify children, knowing very well that many of them already suffer from climate anxiety. The central character is a monster with wicked glowing eyes and claws so sharp and beastly that they could tear a child in two. After saying that the monster knocked over a stew and growled at the bones from the barbecue, the song goes on. Perhaps this beast is here to feast, but on what? Or on who? Filled with fear, the child in the video then asks the monster in the shadows, "Please, tell me why you're here." The answer is simple. To stop that deadly monster, we just have to become vegetarians and eat more plants and veggies, and we'll have to swap meat for either bean stew or barbecue tofu. PCRM and Greenpeace are not the only NGO members belonging to 50 by 40 that deserve a closer look. We'll discuss various other ones in the rest of the video. For now, another interesting point to be made is that some of these partners seem to operate where ideology and profit-making meet. An example is the Good Food Institute, which is the largest lobby group for the vegan tech and so-called alternative protein industry. It was founded in 2016, using funds from the Open Philanthropy Project, and its executive director is a former PETA strategist. Other examples are the True Animal Protein Price Coalition and ProVeg International, who not only partner with vegan and vegetarian associations and animal rights groups, but also with companies invested in the vegan food market. This brings us to the next part of the story, namely the role of industry and finance. In this second part, we'll explore how certain financial interests and key players in the food industry significantly influence anti-livestock narratives. Consider, for example, the CEO of a prominent food corporation who publicly advocated for Americans to reduce their meat consumption. Except that, of course, Americans do not tend to agree. The question then arises, what motivates a food processor to make such an unpopular statement? Or even more remarkably, why is it that almost all of the leading food multinationals seem so interested in this plant-based message, a message that often comes with anti-meat overtones? And why do even some of the major meat processors flirt with the meat alternatives market? To understand this situation, we must recognize how food corporations operate within their historical context. They initially built their fortunes by capitalizing on the post-war demand for convenience, processing raw materials into popular packaged foods and meals. As domestic markets became saturated, these companies expanded globally. To maintain growth for shareholders, they then explored lifestyle marketing to open up new niches. However, there are limits to how many variants of snacks and drinks can be created, leading them to seek new solutions. Support for so-called plant-based foods from these corporations aligns with their core expertise in ultra-processing. Through aggressive marketing, they present such products as healthy and sustainable, despite usually being the highly processed derivative of monocultured crops. This approach allows them to add value through branding, leveraging their ability to transform plant-derived bulk materials into palatable products that mimic animal-sourced foods. As such, this strategy is more interesting to them than having to work with actual animal foods, which come with limited processing options and have low margins. It offers the most significant potential for market revival since the low-fat trend enabled profitable light product lines through technological fixes. Essentially, food multinationals aim to replicate the success of margarine as a substitute for butter, a strategy that was initially successful in the early 20th century and later used more broadly during the low-fat craze of the 1980s. Margarine was first developed in 1869 as a butter imitation for the army and lower classes. The patent was sold to Jergens, which evolved in today's Unilever. Meanwhile, Procter & Gamble introduced Crisco in 1911, originally intended for soap production from cottonseed oil. Initially, margarine was considered a poor imitation of butter, potentially harmful to health and a form of food fraud. However, through clever marketing that associated it with progressive agendas, modernity, science and health, the product's image was inverted and it became one of the food industry's biggest success stories. Margarine was marketed as being nearly identical to butter in appearance, cooking properties and taste. At the same time, however, it was also portrayed as different and better. This is strikingly similar to the marketing strategy used by producers of imitation meat today. It looks, cooks, and tastes the same, but it will also save the planet, the animals, and your health. But will it? The concoction of such imitation foods typically involves extensive processing to combine protein isolate powders, starches, and oils into more or less palatable products. This requires a significant amount of additives to mask off flavors and achieve desired colors and textures. What we're seeing is food technology on overdrive. Food multinationals love it, of course, because that is exactly what they are good at. However, despite these high-tech efforts, imitation foods often fall short of replicating the complex qualities of animal-sourced foods and struggle to capture significant market shares. Nonetheless, many investors are hoping that plant-based imitation foods will replicate the success of light products and margarine, and massive amounts of money have already been thrown at the idea. Bill Gates, for instance, was an early investor in Beyond Meat. However, he wisely cashed out before the hype peaked and the stock value plummeted. Gates continued to advocate for plant-based mock foods nonetheless, arguing that wealthy countries should transition entirely to synthetic beef. Other billionaires, including Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, joined him in funding vegan food industries. Branson, the founder of Virgin Airlines, claims that within a few decades, all meat will be replaced by lab-grown meat and plant-based imitations. Obviously, these predictions are unlikely to materialize, leading to questions about the motivations of these otherwise highly successful investors. Could their financial decision-making be influenced by factors other than rational market analysis? To put it differently, has ideology contaminated part of the investment world? Let's have a look at the great food transformation proclaimed by Rethinks and the way they talk about disruption of food and agriculture. What do they mean? Disruption implies that the dairy and cattle industries will collapse by 2030 and will be displaced by precision fermentation. In this dystopian future, a food as software model and a system of bioreactor foods, databases, and 3D printers will take over. Rethinks is a think tank that was co-founded by investor James Arbib, who is the son of fund management tycoon Martin Arbib. What is driving him? It's clearly not only profit, it's also an ideological urge to save the world. One of the most influential examples of activist-based financing is Jeremy Coller's Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Initiative, abbreviated as FAIR. It claims to be the world's fastest-growing investor network focusing on ESG risks in the global food sector, of which the membership comprises institutional investors managing trillions of dollars in combined assets. Coller is a vegan who wishes to end factory farming, with the goal of putting pressure on food companies to serve more imitation meats. Factory farming could mean lots of things, but make no mistake, the purpose seems to be to destroy as much of animal agriculture as possible. The Saudi Prince Khalid bin Al-Waleed is yet another prominent and militant vegan investor. Besides having called dairy the root of all environmental evil, he has funded various vegan tech companies. Prince Khalid's investments are split between lab-grown animal foods or mock foods on the one hand, and vegan activism and PR on the other hand. This dual strategy supports anti-livestock campaigns while simultaneously investing in technologies designed to replace animal products. His investment company, KBW Ventures, co-owns Plant-Based News, an animal rights outlet known for its propagandistic messaging. This article from Plant-Based News exemplifies the lack of hesitation in using disinformation to further the vegan agenda. It claims that dairy is worse than Coca-Cola, based on a statement from a quote-unquote longevity expert. In reality, this expert is a well-known vegan activist. With this, let's move to part 3 and have a closer look at the role of media. In part 3, we'll look at what is arguably the largest contributor to anti-livestock discourse, the influence of mass media. It's astonishing how this even infiltrates prestigious publications. In 2021, The Economist came up with the following statement: "By cooking so many cows, humans are cooking themselves too." A statement which is obviously more hyperbolic and emotive than journalistic. What's even stranger is that it was picked up again, mid-2023, and repeated weekly from then onwards for a year, on their social media account. To make it even more sensationalist, they added that foregoing steaks may be one of the most efficient ways to reduce our carbon footprint, which is scientifically indefensible and plainly wrong. but the whole operation is also bizarre from a journalistic perspective. Typically, a journalist publishes a piece of news and moves on. This seems more like a commissioned PR campaign than actual journalism. The newspaper The Guardian, in particular, regularly publishes articles with strong anti-livestock sentiment, such as this one from Georges Monbiot. Lab-grown food will soon destroy farming and save the planet. A completely over-the-top article in which he promotes food made from microbes and water produced from thin air. Monbiot's activism is also evident from his endorsement of Replanet and its Reboot Food initiative, which proposes to phase out animal agriculture and replace it by precision fermentation. Here he's standing next to Gunhild Storderlen, the founder of the EAT Foundation, to which we'll return later. It suffices for now to say that Monbiot is part of EAT's advisory board, and so is James Arbib from Rethinks we mentioned in Part 2, another proponent of precision fermentation as a means to destroy livestock farming. In the case of The Guardian, we do know for certain that at least a part of the articles targeting livestock agriculture have been commissioned. The newspaper received almost $2 million from Open Philanthropy to publish a series named Animals Farmed, with the explicit purpose to create negative messages. In Part 2, we already mentioned OP as funder of the Good Food Institute, but their funding activities go way beyond. Open Philanthropy is an extremely wealthy organization with connections to Silicon Valley that supports the vegan food industry, animal rights groups, and media that aligns with its goals. Inspired by effective altruism and transhumanism, Open Philanthropy aims to transform the world, including blurring the lines between humans, animals, and machines. In this worldview, veganism has a clear role to play. An interesting pattern starts to emerge. Open Philanthropy and fellow activist funders, including KBW Ventures, which was discussed in Part 2, the Quinn Foundation and the Stray Dog Institute, the Greenbaum Foundation, and so on, invest large amounts of money in the vegan industry to create a new food market wherein animal-sourced foods are displaced. Strategically, these foundations also multiply anti-livestock messages by funding documentaries like Cowspiracy and by distributing money to befriended media channels. One of the coordinating actors in this operation seems to be Sentient Media, a hub for animal rights-driven journalists, many of whom are also publishing in such outlets as The Guardian and Vox. But this does not suffice. What is also needed is scientific credibility. This is often achieved by incorporating quotes from a select group of academics who support veganism. There are various activistic scientists available worldwide, but in this video, and as a case study, we will focus on the involvement of the CEAP Center at New York University. The center is located within the university's Department of Environmental Studies and focuses on animal rights and consciousness. Key figures include Jeff Sebo, the center's deputy director and a self-described mentor of Sentient Media; Jennifer Jackett, who is the former deputy director of CEAP, and Matthew Hayek, a former researcher at Harvard's Animal Law and Policy program and now at New York University's Department of Environmental Studies. Hayek has worked with Helen Harwatt, previously associated with the Seventh-day Adventist University of Loma Linda, and now involved with both Harvard Animal Law and Chatham House. Such academics, particularly those associated with Sentient Media, are very eager to discredit inconvenient science from successful researchers in livestock agriculture, such as UC Davis professor Frank Mitloehner, a prominent science communicator. Professor Jacquet appears to hold a particular grudge against Mitloehner and published an extensive article accusing him of industry corruption. This critique can only be seen as character assassination masked as academic inquiry, building on a series of previous attacks. The first mediatized campaign against Mitloehner goes back to an article written by Jenny Splitter in Undark in 2021, using quotes from Dr. Hayek. In June 2022, Splitter became managing editor of Sentient Media. A few months later, after having obtained documents through Freedom of Information laws, a new character assassination was delivered by Zach Boren from Greenpeace. Jacquet was cited in the article and accused Mitloehner of being no less than, quote-unquote, a sock puppet for industry. The action was part of a coordinated effort, also involving a journalist from the New York Times, and leading to a hostile article on the front page of the journal. Boren's article was then also used to readdress the case on Sentient Media in a new article by Splitter, and an additional hit piece was published by DeSmog. A year later, in 2023, Jacquet and Hayek doubled down on the case Mitlona, this time being quoted in The Guardian. Subsequently, the article was referenced in Vox, while also mentioning sentient media. This doesn't come as a surprise, given the fact that the journalist has links with Sentient and is known for his focus on anti-meat stories. What to make of all this? Mitlona's response to the accusations was candid. Animal scientists work with animal agriculture. That's it. The conspiracy that so many activists and journalists want to share with you. He continued by saying that he is transparent about his collaborations and research budgets, and that, after all, his job as an expert in the field is precisely to work with industry to improve the environmental performance of the food they grow. In the end, he says, that is what's written in his job description. For the dispassionate observer, it is hard to see what this whole issue is about. Scientific experts in the domain of animal agriculture often work with stakeholders in farming, ranching, or the agri-food industry. When potential conflicts of interest are declared, any accusation of bias is to be seen as an attack on the scientific integrity of the researcher. Besides targeting individual scientists, the group doesn't hold back when it comes to attacking an entire organization, in this case, the Food and Agricultural Organization. The reason is that recent FAO assessments and reports were inconvenient for the anti-livestock cause. Based on the latest available data and tools, the global emissions of livestock were adjusted downwards to 12%. In addition, FAO organized a sustainable livestock conference and published a few reports in which it acknowledged the benefits of animal production. One report was on the role of animal-sourced foods in nutrition and health, another on the feasibility of pathways towards more sustainable livestock systems. In 2023, a sentient media journalist published an article in Vox suggesting that FAO's recent estimate of livestock emissions was erroneous. Some of the scientists quoted in the piece were Joseph Poore from Oxford, another proponent of vegan diets, and yes, Matthew Hayek. Later that year, 2 articles were published simultaneously in The Guardian's Animals Farmed series to accuse FAO of downplaying and censoring inconvenient facts after pressure from livestock groups. Hayek was cited to cast doubt on the update of the emissions data, as well as Jacquet, who predictably suggested that FAO's work is shaped by the meat and dairy industries. Suggesting that FAO's work is distorted by industry pressure is a severe accusation. Responding to the article, Anne Mottet, a former FAO officer, insisted that the organization adheres to best practices and evolving methodologies, whereby better data and tools are the reason for the revision of the number, not industry pressure. But it is difficult to correct a message once the smear campaign has been launched. Unsurprisingly, a few days later, the Guardian articles were picked up by sentient media, closing the circle. But it didn't stop there. The war against FAO seems to be on. In April 2024, a new piece was published in The Guardian, now entitled UN Livestock Emissions Reports Seriously Distorted Our Work, say experts, with one of the experts being, you guessed it, Matthew Hayek. This was followed by an NGO campaign to put additional pressure in the form of a letter directed at FAO's Director General. The letter was undersigned by such organizations as Greenpeace, Plant-Based Treaty, Plant-Based Data, Compassion in World Farming, and a whole range of animal rights activists and vegetarian or vegan societies. Individual academics like Jennifer Jacquet and Joseph Poore are also among the signatories. As a last example, the exact same group, using the exact same playbook, also tried to destabilize the Dublin Declaration. Sentient media made the first move, publishing an article with an accusatory tone and headline, "The Dublin Declaration is riddled with animal industry bias," quoting Hayek to create an aureole of scientific credibility. But the motivation was just more of the same, saying that most of the signatures are from people affiliated with animal agriculture in some way. While this is true, it also means that these individuals are experts in their field, with first-hand knowledge of the subject matter and working on ways to improve the industry. Despite the usual framing, the article failed to present any substantial evidence or logical arguments against the scientific validity of the Dublin Declaration. It is worth noting again that sentient media is financially dependent on some of the major investors in the vegan food industry, highlighting the irony of their accusations. As during the campaign against Mitlona, Boran from Greenpeace submitted a Freedom of Information request, this time targeting Chargas, the Irish Agricultural Research Centre that hosted the related conference in Dublin. The emails obtained did not reveal any meaningful improprieties, as the declaration was neither funded by nor influenced by industry. However, this did not deter them from engaging in another framing exercise. Instead of collaborating with the New York Times, as they had done in the Mitlona campaign, this time they involved The Guardian. Hayek and Jacquet were quoted. A sentient media-affiliated journalist then published articles in DSMOG to paint a picture of industry interference with the COP28 agenda, quoting Jacquet and referring to the Dublin Declaration as propaganda, and then recycled it in both The Guardian and sentient media. Meanwhile, the CEAP Centre has come up with its own declaration, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. Although we already have looked into the collaboration between media and academics, it's time to look more in detail into the scientific aspects of anti-livestock activities too. Stay tuned for part 4. In this section, let's examine how some academic researchers are prioritizing activism over science, leading to radical and potentially harmful statements that lack solid evidence. In part 3 of our video series, we already highlighted how scientists affiliated with New York University's CEAP Center are involved in anti-livestock media campaigns funded by wealthy, effective altruist foundations. Their commitment is also evident in this CEAP document aimed at policymakers. Proposed measures include divesting from livestock agriculture, forcing private restaurants to offer vegan options, disclosing the greenhouse gas impact of meals on menus, and even taxing or banning certain animal-based foods. Another group of interest, the True Health Initiative, claims to combat misinformation on health and environmental issues. While this mission sounds commendable and several members are respected experts, there are serious concerns about the credibility of others. Its members include, for instance, New Age figure Deepak Chopra and vegan activist Neil Barnard and Michael Greger. The group also features the founder of the EAT Foundation and Harvard's Walter Willett, the main architect of the semi-vegetarian planetary health diet. Willett and the initiative's founder, David Katz, are prominent figures within this organization. When a series of scientific articles on red and processed meats was set to be published in the November 2019 edition of the journal Annals of Internal Medicine, the True Health Initiative attempted to block their release during the embargo period, which is unheard of. Despite the articles being peer-reviewed and based on the gold standard for evidence grading, they were targeted because their conclusions were inconvenient for the plant-based agenda. Much to the dismay of Katz and Willett, the authors had concluded that the evidence supporting restrictions on red and processed meat intake for health reasons was weak and uncertain, and therefore insufficient to support strong recommendations. The journal's editor-in-chief had to shut down her inbox after receiving over 2,000 emails in just half an hour. She later mentioned that her journal had published extensively on firearm injury prevention, yet the reaction from the True Health Initiative was more vitriolic than that of the National Rifle Association. The editor stood firm and the articles were published. However, Willett and the True Health Initiative actively continued to label them as disinformation, attempting to link them to industry interests, dismissing the well-respected journal in which they were published as sensationalist media, and questioning the integrity of the involved scientists, including Gordon Guyatt, a founding father of evidence-based medicine and a giant in his field. Here is an intriguing snapshot of the True Health Initiative's website as of mid-2024, when the present video was made. The website featured 2 main categories of scientific information. The first category addresses so-called questionable resources, 4 in total. It includes an FAO report on animal source foods, which is a balanced document based on input from respected scientists and acknowledges the nutritional value of animal source foods. It also features the Pure Study, the world's largest epidemiological cohort led by Salim Yusuf, one of the most cited scientists of all time. There is a paper by Pierre Ederer, who criticizes much of the ideology behind anti-livestock science and who co-founded the Dublin Declaration on the societal role of livestock alongside the Dublin Declaration itself. The reasons for labeling these resources as unreliable are largely unsubstantiated. In the case of the Dublin Declaration, the critique doesn't extend beyond a weak attempt to accuse it of industry bias, a point spearheaded by sentient media, which we also addressed in the previous part. The second category contains the resources that the organisation endorses as trustworthy. Among these are an internal opinion piece and an interview with the organisation's founder, David Katz. 2 other articles are authored by scientists associated with the CEP Center, including Jennifer Jackay's character assassination of Frank Mitloehner, and a document published by Harvard's Animal Law Department, co-authored by Matthew Hayek and Helen Harwatt. Additionally, there is a generic piece on misinformation and an outdated article by Ansel Keys on the alleged dangers of saturated fat. This selection seems rather odd for an organization that claims to be authoritative, critical, and evidence-driven. If anything, this selection suggests quite the opposite. Plenty more examples of anti-livestock advocacy can be found in the scientific community, also at the level of individual scientists. Here are just a few notable instances. One paper proposes using compassion-inducing visual stimuli on product packaging or in restaurant decor to discourage meat consumption. A similar idea involves provoking disgust towards meat, such as by tainting meat with blue coloring or employing strategies similar to those used on cigarette packages. A bioethicist from New York University even suggested the use of meat patches designed to create allergic reactions to beef. Other scientists have proposed tactics like meat shaming, which aims to manipulate the emotions and intentions of meat eaters. One approach specifically targets feelings of regret, particularly among older populations, by suggesting that public acceptance of lab-grown meat could be increased if emotions like guilt and pride were exploited, or if a sense of regret is instilled in those who fail to act. During the United Nations Food Systems Summit, one researcher presented the idea to attack the association between meat and desirable masculine traits, such as strength and decision-making autonomy. Others have taken this even further and have proposed to reframe meat consumption as a form of toxic masculinity, suggesting that men who prioritize physical violence and place high importance on sex are more likely to consume meat. There is also the notion of just banning meat, as mentioned earlier for CEP's policy proposals, with one professor going as far as to advocate for it as part of a climate lockdown. Finally, the most extreme proposal is a plea to legally enforce a society without livestock agriculture, making vegan diets the default for the majority of the population. But except from initiatives coming from individual scientists, we also see remarkably biased behavior at the level of academic institutions. Here are 2 examples from the social media account of Oxford University, referring to statements of 2 of its scientists. The first one quotes Marco Springman, member of the Eat Lancet Commission, by asking what if we all turned vegan by mid-century, because he claims it's the best way to combat climate change. The second one refers to Joseph Poore, affirming that a vegan diet is the single biggest way to reduce our impact on the planet. These 2 statements are wildly exaggerated, unbalanced and false, yet Oxford does not hesitate to propagate them. We have also seen that several academic institutions have proposed, and sometimes even implemented, plans to ban meat from their canteens. So the question at this stage becomes, why are scientists coming up with such bizarre and over-the-top proposals and claims, and why are some academic institutions going along with this? The reasons are multiple. First of all, scientists who are strongly committed to an ideological viewpoint catalyze the accumulation of confirmation bias, my side bias, and white hat bias. The latter can be defined as the distortion of information in the service of what may be perceived to be righteous ends. When such biases start taking hold of academic communities, a culture that favors strong and simple messages may emerge. Secondly, scientists are no longer only evaluated in terms of their scholarly impact, but also in terms of their societal impact. One of the parameters to operationalize the latter is through societal outreach, by presenting one's research findings in the popular press. To appeal to broader audiences and to improve probabilities of being picked up by popular media, keeping the message bite-sized may be seductive. It is often even being encouraged by funding bodies. Thirdly, governmental funders are known to affect and steer the content of public good research within academia. When governmental health departments are heavily invested in a specific intervention and policy advice, data may be manipulated to fit with political concerns. Academia may then, in turn, also further radicalize governmental opinion by feeding them with extreme scenarios. For example, the 2019 UK Fires Report, which was written by a team from 6 British universities and funded to assist the UK government in meeting its net zero target, called for a 50% reduction of beef and lamb consumption by 2030 and for nothing less than their full phasing out by 2050. Lastly, what may make matters even more concerning is that universities and governments are frequently operating within public-private partnerships, together with large corporations, investors, and activist philanthropic capitalists. In the next and final part of this video series, we will look into the composition and actions of some of the leading public-private partnerships in the anti-livestock agenda. The final part of this series will demonstrate how the previously discussed actors come together through public-private partnerships to effectively advance their varied agendas at both national and global levels. The number of these partnerships is simply overwhelming. They come under various names and acronyms, but often include the same key players, such as the EAT Foundation, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, the World Resources Institute, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, certain factions of the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum, which epitomizes the public-private partnership model. Let's consider one of the largest formations, an umbrella group known as the Global Commons Alliance, a group that openly declares it has a plan for the planet. Some of the members are reputable organizations, making it even more astonishing that extreme anti-livestock sentiment can reach such heights. Take, for instance, the United Nations Environment Programme, which has published an article on its website with the sensationalist title claiming that meat is the world's most urgent problem. Not fossil fuels or nuclear apocalypse. Meat. It makes one wonder how this blatant distortion of reality can be reconciled with the United Nations campaign against online misinformation to protect the vulnerable. In any case, the article highlights that two producers of imitation meat, Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, have been awarded the United Nations' highest environmental honour, the Champion of the Earth Award. In doing so, the United Nations is not only effectively promoting fast food producers, given that these companies are manufacturing highly processed burgers and sausages, but also endorsing extreme agendas. Make no mistake, these companies are not trying to expand choices in the protein market. Their true aim is to eventually eliminate real meat, nothing less. The CEO of Impossible Foods was clear. Livestock are a prehistoric food production technology. Will put the animal agriculture industry out of business. It's that simple. It's likely not that simple, but they certainly seem determined to reach their goal, even if consumers and markets are not really interested. And they can count on massive support. Within the Global Commons Alliance, we also find the EAT Foundation, mentioned earlier in this video, along with an initiative called C40 Cities. Within this initiative, here mentioned in a tweet by the United Nations Climate Change account, mayors of more than a dozen of these cities have pledged to implement the planetary health diet for their citizens by 2030. As a reminder, this diet, designed by Harvard's Walter Willett for the EAT Foundation, is semi-vegetarian, allowing only small amounts of animal-based foods. The city's program has established two targets. The first is a progressive goal to reduce all meat and dairy consumption to the levels recommended by the EAT Foundation, with meat consumption particularly low, similar to levels found in low-income countries. The second target is the so-called ambitious one, aiming for zero meat and zero dairy. As extreme as this may seem, it has been endorsed by mayors of global cities, with most of their citizens likely unaware of this commitment. An example is Milan in Italy, of which the mayor Giuseppe Sala was appointed as a member of the advisory board of the EAT Foundation. You see here a tweet of the World Economic Forum explaining how Milan attempts to replace beef ragu with soy imitations in city meals. Another example is London, with its mayor, Sadiq Khan, serving as the chair of C40 Cities. The city's commitment involves aligning food procurement with the planetary health diet, with a goal of impacting millions of meals per year. Additionally, the mayor plans to ban the advertising of so-called unhealthy foods, which could be used to target meat. Then there's Paris, led by its bourgeois bohemian mayor, Anne Hidalgo. The anti-livestock agenda became evident during the 2024 Olympic Games, when vegetarian options were imposed on athletes and meat was difficult to obtain, much to their dismay. New York joined the initiative somewhat later, when Mayor Eric Adams was elected and decided to incorporate his vegan lifestyle into city policy. As mentioned earlier, New York is also home to the CEAP Center at New York University, which is actively working on shaping city policies towards plant-based eating, including proposals for taxing and banning meat. Here is Eric Adams already at a 2018 meeting of self-proclaimed vegan leaders at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Also present were Gunhild Stordalen, founder of the Eat Foundation, Saudi Prince Khalid Al Walid, a major investor in the vegan tech industry who we encountered in part 2 of the video, Jim Greenbaum of the Greenbaum Foundation, a key supporter of vegan documentaries like Cowspiracy, a sponsor of animal rights groups, an investor in imitation foods, and a funder of the activist journalists at Sentient Media discussed in part 3. Next, we have the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a powerful lobby group for multinationals, as well as the World Resources Institute. Together with the Eat Foundation, they are active within the Food and Land Use Coalition. This coalition was established in 2017 by a core group of influential actors, including the fertilizer giant Yara and the food multinational Unilever. The coalition's management was subsequently taken over by System IQ, a firm founded by former McKinsey executives. Meanwhile, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, in collaboration with the Eat Foundation, also established FRESH. Its members include most of the leading agri-food corporations, as shown in this picture. Both FRESH and the Food and Land Use Coalition trace their origins to Davos-linked circles and were founded around the same time, between 2016 and 2017. Both have Unilever and Yara as core partners. Notably, the World Economic Forum's head of Future of Food is Sean DeClean, ex-Yara. The leading influence in these initiatives was Paul Polman, who served as co-chair of the Food and Land Use Ambassador Network, was CEO of Unilever until 2019, and is a shareholder and director at System IQ. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development often appears in green agenda initiatives, which is ironic given the role of its members in the current highly unsustainable agri-food system. For instance, the WBCSD is part of the Good Life Goals program, alongside the Stockholm Environment Institute and UN Environment. This program aims to develop educational materials to promote sustainable development in schools, with one of its key messages being to cut meat. By now, it should not be hard to guess which products the eliminated meat would need to be replaced with, according to the WBCSD members. There's much more to be said about the WBCSD, but let's refocus on the Food and Land Use Coalition. The coalition's mission is clear. It aims to implement Eat's planetary health diet on a global scale. To achieve this, the coalition has stated that it will deeply engage with the policy, regulatory environment, and businesses of individual countries, targeting regions such as Colombia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, the Nordics, Australia, and Europe. For Australia, this would mean a 90% reduction in red meat consumption, an unrealistic and excessive target. It's hard to imagine that Australians, who cherish their barbecues, will adhere to such a drastic reduction. Resistance to such interventionist plans extends, of course, well beyond Australia, as people worldwide are unlikely to willingly alter their diets. This is why the consortium has invested considerable effort in developing strategies to counteract resistance. For example, the World Resources Institute has devised a strategy using the shift wheel, a marketing tool for social engineering designed to steer consumer choice. This approach includes tactics like disguising the changes so people remain unaware, or creating new habits in emerging markets, and making certain foods, like red meat, socially unacceptable. In the previous part, we already discussed how some academics have suggested tactics like meat shaming. Another tactic involves constraining the visibility of meat, as seen in some supermarkets where meat is placed below eye level, while plant-based alternatives are positioned more prominently. Additionally, the World Resources Institute has proposed a spectrum of interventions, ranging from softer policies, such as altering food displays, or implementing nutritional labeling systems, like Nutri-Score, to drastic interventionist measures like taxes, or even banning meat from restaurant menus. This approach not only mirrors the earlier discussed proposal from New York University's C. Yates Center, but is also echoed by yet another member of the Global Commons Alliance, WWF. Their Bending the Curve report, here highlighted on the WBCSD website, emphasizes the need to leverage the full range of policy tools, noting that dietary change measures rely too heavily on soft measures. The report argues that harder policy tools may be more effective, referring once again to fiscal measures, bans, and elimination of choice. Notably, the lead author of this report is also a former director of science translation at the Eat Foundation, underscoring the interconnected nature of all these organizations who really behave like communicating vessels. The insistence on interventionist strategies by the Food and Land Use Coalition, the World Resources Institute, and WWF is not surprising, given that the EAT Foundation itself has explicitly stated in its EAT Lancet report that hard policy measures are necessary to overcome what they arrogantly describe as the whim of consumer choice. Since it is believed that individuals may not know what's best for them, they need to be guided by laws and a range of fiscal measures, subsidies, and penalties. To achieve this, the EAT Foundation is involved in additional platforms with a specific focus on fiscal measures, alongside the WBCSD. A first example is the World Benchmarking Alliance, which aims to create accountability for those who refuse to change. This benchmarking will determine a given company's fiscal attractiveness based on its compliance with the coalition's goals. The second platform is the Good Food Finance Network, which shares a similar objective. The FAIR initiative is also part of this network. As the world's fastest-growing investor network focused on ESG risks in the food sector and given its strong anti-livestock targets, the direction is clear. With FAIR, we enter the territory of aggressive animal rights ideology. The closing session of the 2021 Rethinking Protein event exemplifies this well, featuring a familiar lineup of usual suspects. Among the panelists were the founder of the EAT Foundation, the co-founder of the Good Food Institute, representing the vegan technology sector, activistic academics, among which Matthew Hayek, and the CEO of 50 by 40, a coalition that includes not only animal rights groups, but also the World Resources Institute. The session centered on discussing legal mechanisms to manipulate the food system, with the phrase, "no one gets left behind," evoking a Davos-style language approach to marketing ideas. Unless one understands the pattern and is familiar with the key players listed in this video, it can be difficult to see through this proliferation of think tanks and platforms. Yet another example is provided by the Food System Economics Commission, a platform in which EAT is involved, and which has the goal to create support for the fiscal agenda needed to change the food system. This platform also includes the Food and Land Use Coalition and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, represented by Johan Rockström, a prominent figure and architect of the EAT network. Funding for these initiatives comes from sources such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the Wellcome Trust, which also funds the EAT Foundation. Public-private partnerships often resemble Russian dolls, and the Global Common Alliance is no exception. Some of its members are large public-private partnerships themselves, such as the Natural Capital Coalition and Ceres. Within these alliances, you'll find some of the world's most polluting companies, including fossil fuel giants and many of the food multinationals we've talked about before. Even Impossible Meat is listed, along with expected participants like WBCSD and WWF. Another example is the We Mean Business Coalition, a business platform associated with various members of the Global Commons Alliance, including BSR, CDP, Ceres, and WBCSD. One of the partners, the B Team, was co-founded by Richard Branson, the billionaire investor who was already mentioned in Part 2 as a promoter of vegan industries. Among the so-called leaders of the B Team are former CEOs of Unilever and Danone, as well as Christiana Figueres. Figueres is known for her strong anti-livestock stance, even advocating that meat-eaters should be treated like smokers and banned from restaurants. As the former executive secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, she is high up in the hierarchy and also has connections with Unilever, Impossible Foods, and the World Resources Institute. Incidentally, the World Resources Institute's board includes prominent bankers, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Davos elites. It's also worth noting that Figueres' brother, a former president of Costa Rica, served as CEO of the World Economic Forum from 2003 to 2004, but he had to resign following a controversy over payments he received from the French telecommunications company Alcatel while still involved in politics. The World Economic Forum is well known for frequently promoting anti-meat messages, such as the suggestion to tax meat-eaters like smokers, a message, as you can see here, retweeted by Gunhild Stordalen of the EAT Foundation. This is where things really start to converge. Stordalen was appointed as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2015. Her EAT Foundation is literally referred to as a Davos for food and aims to add value to business and industry and set the political agenda. It's no surprise, then, that Davos has strongly supported EAT. Following the launch of the EAT Lancet report in 2019, the World Economic Forum stated on its website that We all need to go on the planetary health diet to save the world. Just days later, the report was discussed at the 2019 Davos meeting and subsequently presented at the UN headquarters in New York. The World Economic Forum's support for Eat's Great Food Transformation extends beyond mere sympathy. It is part of its Great Reset agenda and its interest in the future of food. Taken together, Eat appears to function as the dietary arm of Davos, aiming to achieve its goals within what is said to be the transition decade, 2020 to 2030. To do so, Davos refers to a portfolio of solutions, including mock meat, lab meat, mycoprotein, and insects. In collaboration with McKinsey, the World Economic Forum published a document in 2018 to promote alternative proteins, with Impossible Foods cited as an example. A year later, Davos released a white paper on alternative proteins, prepared by the Oxford Martin School, as part of its Meet the Future series. Stordalen maintains close ties with Børge Brende, the current president of the World Economic Forum and a fellow Norwegian national. Brende is a former Norwegian minister, ex-chairman of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, and a member of the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group. He joined the World Economic Forum in 2008, assumed the role of managing director in 2011 after an unsuccessful bid for the executive directorship of the UN Environment Programme, and was appointed as its president in 2017. It should be obvious by now that there are multiple connections between the EAT Foundation, the UN, and Davos, which are not mere coincidences. The ties between the World Economic Forum and the United Nations have only intensified over the last years, and especially since 2019, when Davos established an official partnership with the UN to accelerate the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In this picture, you see Børge Brende and Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, along with the United Nations Secretary-General. This strategic alliance has faced criticism for what some view as a disturbing corporate capture of the UN and the risk that government decisions could become secondary to corporation-led initiatives. The strategy is clear and in line with Davos's Great Reset: leverage global challenges, such as climate change and pandemic risk, to create a sense of urgency and justification for interventionism, to the benefit of its members. The EAT Foundation's emphasis on a broken food system seamlessly aligns with this strategy. The strategic alignment between the UN and the EAT Davos cluster became particularly notable during the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. Stordalen was appointed chair of the summit's Action Track 2, which focused on sustainable diets. The stated aim was to take full advantage of the summit and to force the kind of far-reaching changes that the world now desperately needs. Concerns have been raised about the recruitment of leaders for the summit's action tracks due to a lack of transparency and the absence of key expertise. Action Track 2 in particular was fully aligned with the EAT Foundation's network, leaving no room for opposing voices. Its youth vice chair was a vegan advocate and climate activist, while its civil society leader was the CEO of 50 by 40, an organisation representing vegetarian pressure groups. Among the workstream leaders were a vegan activist from the Chinese Good Food Fund, the founder of Brighter Green, an organisation with an animal rights agenda, Helen Harwat from Chatham House and Harvard's Animal Law Department, mentioned earlier in Part 3, and representatives from the World Resources Institute and WWF. The Good Food Institute was invited to lead the innovation pillar, suggesting that the plan was to mobilise technology from the vegan imitation food industries. And, not without importance, the World Health Organization was appointed as the track's anchoring agency. One of the World Health Organization's directors, Francesco Branca, is also an Eat Lancet commissioner and has already made it clear that, within the food system, quote-unquote, everything has to be reset. He has argued for significantly reducing the amount of meat on our tables, stating that we need to reset and we need to adjust. We need the policies, the investments, on the supply side and the consumer side. The WHO will be working on the consumer side. As expected, Action Track 2's output followed a familiar pattern. Already in its first draft document, the definition of healthy diets referred exclusively to plant-based foods, with no mention of meat, dairy, eggs or fish whatsoever. To address the resulting food gap, microbial protein, insects and algae were proposed as solutions, probably to the delight of the Good Food Institute. The document also expanded on several approaches to food system changes already mentioned, such as aligning dietary guidelines with the Eat Lancet recommendations, weaponizing front-of-pack labels, altering food availability options, modifying meals served in schools and hospitals, and targeting children by inducing a so-called cultural shift in education. Finally, certain companies would have to be excluded from investment portfolios if they deviate from the ESG agenda and the party line prescribed by Collar's Fair Initiative. But then, hell broke loose during the UN Food Systems Summit when a consortium of 70 stakeholders established a sustainable livestock cluster. Immediately, representatives and allies of Action Track 2 were dispatched to sabotage the initiative. The usual suspects united in a single front: WBCSD, FAIR, the Good Food Institute, 50 by 40, Compassion in World Farming, Eats Marco Springman, and, once again, Matthew Hayek and Helen Harwatt. However, their radicalism and non-constructive approach and their evident ill intentions ultimately backfired, undermining the success originally envisioned by the EAT cluster within the summit. Even though the summit didn't go as planned for the EAT cluster, this is far from the end of the battle over the food system. Meanwhile, the Action Track leaders from the summit have regrouped and aligned their mission with that of the Club of Rome and C40 cities. High on their agenda is the establishment of an IPCC for food, an idea originally proposed by the World Economic Forum and its agenda contributor Joachim von Braun, who also chaired the UN Food Systems Summit's scientific group. With the Club of Rome, we are revisiting old-school technocracy. The club has been known for its doom-laden scenarios since the late 1960s, most notably through its Limits to Growth report. Addressing population growth was all the hype in those days. In 1969, a Rockefeller Commission on Population Growth advocated for a shift away from livestock consumption toward vegetables, and yes, synthetic meats, or even a closed system of agriculture, food from factories. They also proposed that a central group should be assigned responsibility to serve as a lobby for the future. 5 decades later, this vision is exactly what we are seeing unfold. The anti-livestock agenda is now so pervasive that attempts to shape food policies are found everywhere, even at the highest levels. Here you see the example of a tool commissioned by the World Health Organization and developed by Marco Springman, a member of Eat Lancet. As the WHO makes clear, the tool is designed to drive country policies. Unsurprisingly, it emphasizes Eat's planetary health diet and promotes vegan and vegetarian options. To conclude, anti-livestock agendas are real, aggressive, well-funded, and coordinated, but they are also blinded by ideology, which leads to excessive demands and problematic arguments. Ideology does not explain everything, of course, as part of the push is driven by profit-seeking and attempts to obtain increased control over the food system. This also explains why anti-livestock agendas are so disproportionately influential, given that they are not endorsed by the large majority of global populations. Ironically, the same actors portray any critique and dissident voices as compromised by conflicts of interest, based on alleged links with the livestock industry. This video shows how much of a pot versus kettle situation this really is. The antidote to such disinformation is to insist on the best of evidence. That is precisely what the Dublin Declaration advocates for. Nothing more, yet certainly nothing less. Thank you for watching.